Hi everyone, welcome to 24 Hours of PaaS Summit Preview 2015. We're excited you could join us today for Joey D'Antoni's session, Finding Your Balance, BI in the Cloud, On-Premises or Both. And this is the 19th session of the 24 Hours of PaaS event. So this 24 Hours of PaaS event consists of 24 consecutive live webcasts delivered by expert speakers from the PaaS community. This session is a preview of one of the many technical sessions that will be presented at PaaS Summit in October this year. Recordings will be available in 1 week at 24hoursofpaas.com. My name is Julie Cosmano, Senior Program Manager at Microsoft for the Data Platform Group, and I have a few quick introduction slides before I hand over the reins to Joseph D'Antoni. He will speak for 40 to 45 minutes, and then we'll move on to the Q&A, where you can ask any questions you may have. If you have any questions or if you are experiencing any issues, just type your question into the question pane on the GoToWebinar control panel, and someone will assist you. Feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A field at any time. Once we get to the Q&A portion of the session, I'll read off your questions to the speaker. Since all attendees are muted, you will need to submit questions by typing in the Q&A field. Also, there will be a short evaluation at the end of the session, and your feedback is important to us, so please take a moment to complete it, and the survey will appear in your browser. The staging of 24 Hours of PaaS would not be possible without the support and dedication of our sponsors. They are the reason this event is available to you free of charge. I'd like to take a moment to thank our presenting sponsors, Microsoft, Dell Software, and Idera. In addition, I'd also like to thank the supporting sponsors for this event, HP, SQL Sentry, and Pyramid Analytics. Next, I'd like to bring your attention to one of my favorite SQL conferences, which is PaaS Summit, taking place in Seattle, Washington from October 27th to the 30th. PaaS Summit 2015 will feature over 200 sessions with world-class SQL Server experts. Planned and presented by the SQL Server community for the SQL Server community, PaaS Summit is single-handedly the largest gathering of SQL Server and BI professionals in the world. With over 5,000 registrants from all over the world, PaaS Summit is also a great place to network and meet face-to-face with experts, peers, and MVPs. More importantly, PaaS Summit delivers on providing you with the answers to your SQL Server issues, along with the knowledge, strategies, and skills you need to stay ahead of the curve. You can save $200 right now by using the discount code 24HOP15 as shown on the screen right now when you register. Optimize your savings by registering before the end of this Sunday, September 20th. To find out more about the PaaS Summit, visit paassummit.com. Make sure you explore everything PaaS has to offer for data professionals. You can join local user groups around the world, virtual chapters, find free online resources through our Learning Center, and read up on the latest community news in the Connector newsletter. For those interested in business analytics, check out the PaaS Business Analytics Conference happening in May next year. Visit paasbaconference.com for more information or to subscribe to our bi-weekly BA Insights newsletter. And now, please allow me to present the speaker of the hour, Joey, who is an experienced senior architect and SQL Server MVP. I've had the pleasure of reading his Using Power BI in a Hybrid Environment that he co-authored. So I'm very confident that you will be learning lots about BI strategy from him in this session. Over to you, Joey.
Thanks, Julie. So this session, and Julie mentioned, I wrote a white paper with a fellow MVP and fantastic friend of mine, Stacia Varga, excuse me, but called Building Power BI in a Hybrid Environment. We wrote that last year, so things have changed a little. A lot of the fundamentals of what we talked about in the white paper are still the same. And Stacia and I actually put together this pre-con called Finding Your Balance, BI in the Cloud, On-Premises or Both, because the world is changing so much with a cloud-focused world with a lot of software as a service and, frankly, analytics as a service now. When we're talking about things like Power BI, We wanted to highlight everything about it, right? So in this pre-con, we're going to talk a lot about how you put everything together, how you make it work, what are your data sources, when do you choose a cloud data source versus a on-prem data source, and how you make those decisions. So this is going to be a really exciting pre-con, and this hour is going to be kind of an overview of what I'm going to talk about in the pre-con and where we're going to go. So just a little bit more about my background. I've worked with SQL Server and lots of other databases for a long time now, 15 years. Done a lot of work with big data. I'm principal consultant at Denituri & Associates, Microsoft certified for BI and SQL Data Platform. You can find me at joeydantoni.com. And if you have any questions after this, the best place to hit me up is on Twitter, and you can find me there at jdanton or on my blog at joeydantoni.com. So today's agenda. The first thing we're going to talk about is the current Microsoft BI landscape. Man, this is a big can of beans. The current Microsoft BI landscape changes pretty much every day. Microsoft released a new release of the Power BI client today. So things change daily. For those of you who are business intelligence professionals, you know, and this is probably the biggest challenge of doing a presentation like this, is staying on top of what's going on in the world of BI as we speak. So we're going to kind of walk through. This is this should be 99% current. I'm pretty sure I'm on top of things. We're going to talk about what's new in SQL Server 2016 BI. Some of this is going to lead into some engine stuff. One of the things I've been working on with the client, hi Richard, is we have a client that's currently on production in SQL Server 2016. They're in a data warehouse, so we've done a lot of work with them. There's some real benefits to 2016 data warehousing. There are also some real improvements to the BI tools in 2016. SSRS finally gets some attention from Microsoft. It's been a long time since that's happened. SSIS tabular is also getting a lot of benefits. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the BI client. So from a 2013 perspective, Excel was our main tool for BI, right? We had Power View, we had Power Pivot. Eventually we got Power Query, which is a fantastic tool that evolved out of Data Explorer. That eventually moved into somewhat the Power BI desktop client. So we'll talk about how and when you should use each tool and what your scenarios might be. Next, we'll talk about data gateways. So data gateways are how you either do refreshing of your data from Power BI to on-prem data sources, or in some cases doing real-time querying. You can do real-time querying to an on-prem analysis services tabular model, and that will probably extend to other data sources in the future. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about making this seamless. So we'll talk about single sign-on, and if you can make it to the pre-con, we'll talk about single sign-on a lot more, because it's going to be a little bit complicated. There's a lot of moving parts to that, and we'll walk through that in this session, and we'll talk about it a lot more in the pre-con. So the modern BI world is a little crazy. I've been working with databases for, I'm dating myself now, it's 16 years. And when I started, our databases were pretty small. I remember working on a database that was on Unix, and we had a 2 gig file limit, so we didn't have too much big data. But now we have social media, we have the Internet of Things, so we have things like smart thermostats, smart appliances. Stores have Wi-Fi, so retail's collecting way more data. We're collecting data from the web. We're collecting insights, doing sentiment analysis, doing real-time analytics. And now we have this thing called the cloud, which if you've been asleep for the last several years, Microsoft has made a huge push in the cloud, and we have the ability to do things in a way more flexible fashion, and we can do experiments that don't cost a lot of money. And bringing all this stuff together has become the real challenge of modern BI, right? It's no longer we just have our point of sale systems in our data warehouse. We have a lot more stuff, and we have all the software as a service stuff, and wondering how we bring it together. So I borrowed this slide from Microsoft, and thanks to them, but I really like it because it shows all the potential places we have challenges in data that we bring together. So some concepts that we're going to talk about in this session. The first one is self-service BI. I hardly ever think there's truly self-service BI because someone has to do data quality, right? The biggest challenge of business intelligence is building a solid data model that our end users can report on easily. So there's that. There's SharePoint. So SharePoint was our hub for on-prem BI traditionally in SharePoint 2010 and SharePoint 2013. We could house reporting services there. We could house PowerPoint there, to an extent Power Pivot. And frankly, SharePoint was and still kind of is the hub to Power BI. So we'll talk a little bit about Power BI V1 and V2. Security, security by far, when I'm working with clients, this is the biggest concern I run into about using the cloud at all. There's some irony in this. I've had clients who had their entire server room in a closet in their office who are really concerned about the security in Microsoft Azure. I understand that to an extent. There's a little bit of paranoia about cloud, but the cloud can be as secure as you make it. You can have a really insecure cloud, or you can build it secure and very tight and to meet all the standards. Azure data centers are well certified. They meet all major security requirements. So building secure applications in the cloud is very doable. We'll talk a little bit about SSIS. So SSIS gets some big improvements as we roll into SQL 2016. We'll talk a little bit about content packs. Content packs are things your company can build to serve other customers into Power BI. Software as a service. So software as a service is Power BI. Definitely a great platform. Other software as a service providers that are going to integrate with Power BI, things like Salesforce, many companies use. We'll talk a little bit about hybrid networks. So the cool thing about, in my opinion, Azure infrastructure as a service, to kind of tie this together, is that once you have your hybrid network in place, Azure infrastructure as a service truly feels like an extension of your data center. There's no real, your VMs don't suddenly have cloud desktops on them. It just feels like your data center. It's in your IP space, it's in your network space. You just get a lot more flexibility with the cloud service. We'll talk a little bit about SQL DB, and we'll talk probably a little bit more about SQL DW, SQL Data Warehouse. So this is a relatively new service that Microsoft has introduced this year that's kind of built on Analytics Platform System. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Analytics Platform System, that's what we used to call Parallel Data Warehouse. Those features have been integrated into SQL Data Warehouse, and it's available as a service offering as a very cost-effective mechanism. We'll talk a little bit about Office 365. That's kind of history now with Power BI. Talk a little bit about Azure Data Lake. There's a slide or two there, and talk a little bit about big data. So classic data analysis was pretty traditional, right? We had a couple of standard OLTP systems. We'd build a data warehouse and have some BI solutions on top of it. But that data we can pull is just a fragment of the full range of data that's accessible to our enterprises, especially nowadays. One type of data can come from cell phones, so especially if your company has an app on iPhone or Android or Windows Phone. There are 4 billion cell phones in the world, each generating its own mountain of data. Or maybe you're a company that does scientific research working with instruments. The Large Hadron Collider, for example, generates 40 terabytes of data per second. And even if your industry doesn't have mobile or email, maybe you're a healthcare company that has to archive your email. I worked for a medical device company once that, man, they were always in legal trouble, so we had to archive every email. And even things like audio or video files. I did a really cool project once for a client that was archiving all their call center data into Hadoop after they transcribed it to text. And then they were doing sentiment analysis on that data. So there's some very interesting functionality we can do. And a lot of this is enabled by cloud data sources and big data solutions, because as great as relational databases are, and I'm never going to be one of those people who like slags on relational databases for not being effective at scale, because they really are. But it just becomes a lot easier to process mountains of data when we can easily scale out like we can with things like Hadoop. So let's talk about a little bit about Power BI. So if you've read my white paper or looked at the original Power BI, when I was doing this stuff, I was working for a BI consultancy, and man, we had some challenges selling this. It was a good product, so it was very fundamentally similar to the combination of SharePoint and Power 2013 and Power View and Power Pivot. We did have some added functionality. We had Q&A, so Q&A, which is built into the new Power BI, which we'll call Power BI 2.0, and I'm sure Microsoft doesn't love us calling it 1.0 and 2.0, but it's effectively what it is. There is limited mobile functionality, so there was an HTML5 preview mode. For example, if you see that, if you see the little box to the right of the line chart there, that would enable HTML5 preview mode. Also, your mobile browser would default to HTML5 preview mode. So there was some limited amount of mobile functionality, but there were no apps. And let's face it, we're in a modern world where especially executives just want an app where they go and see Power BI. The other thing that was challenging, and this is a twofold challenge, was it was cost prohibitive for many customers because it was tied to Office 365. So Office 365 required us to have one of the higher tier subscriptions. I think it was E3 or E4, and then Power BI was a $20 a month add-on for that. So we were looking at $50 a user per month, which wasn't necessarily cost prohibitive for a smaller shop who only had a handful of employees. But when you get into larger shops or shops that had a ton of external customers, it just didn't really work out. It wasn't feasible. So introducing January of this year, Power BI 2.0. And if you haven't seen this, you should really check it out. It's fantastic. We get this nice dashboard where we have way more visualizations than we currently had. We have all these software as a service data sources. So we can grab data from Marketo, GitHub, Dynamic CRM, Salesforce, Zendesk. There are more out there that I'm not mentioning. We can do real-time querying against Azure Stream Analytics, Azure SQL DB, and HD Insight. HD Insight's Microsoft's Hadoop as a service offering, and we can do those real-time queries against cloud data sources with minimal configuration. So we can get that up and running very quickly. There's a couple ways we can get those visualizations and data models into Power BI. We can use Excel, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation. Excel 2013 with Power Query is still one of the more robust ways to do it. But the Power BI desktop is something Microsoft has introduced, which is a free tool. So Excel does require a license. The Power BI desktop is free. And the other thing is the Power BI desktop, I think, is probably a little bit more easier for Microsoft to keep up to date and get changes into than Power Query. So I think changes occur faster. The other couple of things we have here are the Power BI Analysis Services Connector and the Power BI Personal Gateway. And both of these allow us to, well, the AS connector allows us to do real-time querying against analysis services tabular models. So we can have an analysis services tabular model on-prem, and we can load that into Power BI and do real-time querying. We can also query workbooks that are in OneDrive. We can query SQL databases, and we can do numerous other on-prem data sources using either OData or a variety of data sources. So this is really compelling. Additionally, we have the Power BI web browser. So we have Power Q&A there. It's no longer called that. It's natural language query. We have visual exploration, so we can see maps. We can do a wider variety of visualizations that we can before. We can also have the Power BI mobile apps, and these work on Android, iPhone, and Windows Phone. The iPhone stuff is fantastic. We have been asking for that forever, and there are different applications for each version of iDevice that you're on, which is my most familiarity. I'm an Android person. And then we also have real-time dashboards on where we can use a push API to generate real-time data. Not as much of interest to a ton of customers, but for those of you who need real-time analytics, it's possible. So next, let's talk a little bit about Cloud BI. So in this section of the presentation, we're going to be focused on SQL DB and SQL Data Warehouse. So SQL Database, for those of you who have worked with SQL Server for a long time, this was one of Microsoft's first cloud offerings. And if you remember, we had SQL DB, and for a while we had Azure reporting services in the cloud, so we could report against our SQL databases. Originally, it was this really small subset of both T-SQL language and the SQL engine. There was a lot of stuff you could do on on-prem SQL Server that you couldn't do in SQL DB, and if I remember correctly, originally the limit on a SQL Server DB or SQL DB was 5 gig, and may have even been smaller than that. Now it's nearly code complete. On the high end of the scale, we can scale up to 1 terabyte. So we have features that are ahead of the current release. So one of the great things Microsoft is doing is they're an operations shop now. So traditionally, Microsoft just developed software. Now Microsoft develops software and runs operations. So you can get features in your V12 SQL DB that you can't get in SQL 2014, like row-level security, dynamic data masking. Those are things that are going to be in SQL 2016, but aren't currently available. So SQL DB, very cool. We'll talk a little bit more shortly about how you decide which data sources you want to go with. So historically, data warehouses required big combinations of storage and compute. I mean, data warehouses were traditionally our largest databases in our environment. And they frequently, frankly, underutilized really expensive resources. You had to buy really big servers, or perhaps you bought a really big appliance, and those cost a ton of money. What SQL Data Warehouse offers us is the ability to compute, to do data and compute scale independently. You can dynamically grow, shrink, and even pause your compute scale and get best-in-class price and performance. SQL Data Warehouse also uses T-SQL, which easily allows you to integrate query results across your data warehouse and non-relational data. So we have the ability to see things like HD Insight, and other data sources. The other thing SQL Data Warehouse takes advantage of, much like Parallel Data Warehouse or Analytic Platform System, is Microsoft's massively parallel processing architecture. You pay for the time to insight, and basically you have multiple copies of your tables across virtual machines in a SQL Data Warehouse environment. But things like scanning, loading, and query processing work great when you have a massively parallel environment. The other huge thing that SQL Data Warehouse does, and APS does this as well, is uses column store indexes and the advanced cost-based query optimization to really give you super query performance. I've been doing a lot of work on SQL 2016 with column store indexes, and the improvements we've seen and the compression we've seen are huge. The other thing about SQL Data Warehouse is that you can deploy it in seconds. So much like you deploy a SQL database, this is a very simple offering, and it's fully managed. You're not managing your data files. You're not doing space management. SQL Data Warehouse also has built-in data backups. So much like SQL DB, which also has similar backups, it's going to back up your data with an algorithm based on rate of change, and it's going to back it up to blob storage. So you have point-in-time recovery. So the way you acquire SQL database and pay for it is you buy what's called data warehouse units, and this is very similar to a SQL database, where you have database throughput units, And the more DWUs you have, the more performance, the more compute power you have. If you can decrease your DWUs, you go back to paying for the smaller amount of them. So storage and compute are paid for separately. And really the magic of SQL Data Warehouse is that it uses distributed queries. So it uses an advanced optimizer that figures out how to optimize distributed queries based on the cost of the operations. And it's going to move data across computing resources as necessary to optimize the query. And then finally, column store is really huge from a performance gain perspective. With column store indexes, you're going to see up to 5 and even 10x I've seen in some clients compression gains over traditional row-oriented storage. The other benefit you get with column store indexes is greater query performance by the use of batch mode. So you're processing 1,000 rows of data at a time versus 1. And particularly data warehouse queries work very well because they frequently scan either an entire table or a partition. So obviously this isn't going to be what you're going to want to use for your OLTP systems, but for your data warehouse systems, this is definitely the right space. Excuse me. The one other thing I'll mention is you get the benefit of polybase. So the Hadoop mentioned in the top right corner of this slide, polybase allows you to query against Hadoop data sources and Azure Blob Storage. A very big benefit because you can get some basically cheaper storage in an HDFS kind of file system. So where does SQL DW fit in the scope? So a couple of things. We're going to talk a little bit more about infrastructure as a service in a few slides, but these are some Microsoft recommendations. So if you're using a traditional application and you want to use a SQL VM, this is going to work for both OLTP and data warehouse workloads. With SQL Server VMs, you can scale out using always-on availability groups, which tends to work pretty well for data warehouses. Straight lift and shift. There's minimal amounts of code conversion in order to do that. And these are services that can be managed by a customer. 1 to 1 terabyte plus, depending on the size of your VM, you can really scale these up to petabyte scale. Azure SQL database. So these are OLTP or data warehouse workloads. Frankly, from a data warehouse workloads, if you're using Azure SQL database, you're looking at Azure Data Mart. These are going to probably require some net new development. Just because of the data size limit, you're going to have to work on scaling out versus scaling up. And this is a fully managed service. You don't have to worry about things like service packs or cumulative updates or how full your data files are. That's all going to be taken care of for you. And on the high end, you can scale this up to 1 terabyte. Azure SQL Data Warehouse, on the other hand, is really exclusively focused on data warehouse. So think of the easiest way to think of this is parallel data warehouse or analytics platform system in the cloud, fully managed. You get dynamic compute scaling, and you can pause it, so you only pay for when you're using it. From that perspective, it's really great if a good example would be retail, where you're only using your data warehouse for part of the year. Really great application for SQL Data Warehouse. So how do we get our data there? One of the things I wanted to talk about a little bit, because I think it's a little nebulous to many folks who are using Microsoft Business Intelligence Stack, Azure Data Factory. So there's a little bit of confusion around Azure Data Factory versus SQL Server Integration Services. The way I view Data Factory is currently it's an ETL service for data transformation within Azure, and it's priced by service. You only pay for how much data you transform. However, it's still relatively immature, but you can easily ingest data from on-premises source and cloud services. You can connect to on-prem sources through a data management gateway and pull data into Azure that way, and take advantage of the Data Factory's globally deployed data movement as a service to get data where it needs to go. You're going to, frankly, if you're using this right now, you're going to have to write a little more custom code than you would if you're just using SSIS. Like every Azure service, this is maturing quite rapidly. And it's funny, doing these Azure and Power BI presentations can be quite challenging because we're literally changing every day as Microsoft makes changes, and it's awesome because we're getting new features, and we don't have the hassle of like doing software upgrades the way we used to. So you get the new features immediately, but as a presenter, it's a little bit of a challenge. So infrastructure as a service, just wanted to talk a little bit about this. This is Azure VMs and Azure networks. Still from a business intelligence perspective, if you're just looking to do a lift and shift and move into the cloud, this can be a really good way to go because you can acquire some really big VMs in the cloud, so you can get a lot of compute power and resources. You can scale out, so you can use numerous techniques. So you can use always-on availability groups. You can use replication, traditional or log shipping to do scale-out reporting, depending on what your environment is. And frankly, if you're just looking to do a lift and shift to take advantage of some cloud resources, infrastructure as a service is a great way to go because it's just moving your data to a different data center effectively. It's not like you have to do any code changes. So Azure Data Lake, and this isn't in public preview yet, and I'm confident none of what I'm saying is violating my NDA with Microsoft because I got this off the web today. But Azure Data Lake is going to be a Hadoop file system that's compatible with the entire Hadoop ecosystem, and it's integrated with Azure HD Insight, which is Microsoft's Hadoop as a service offering, and it's going to be integrated with some of the features that Microsoft recently acquired, like Revolution R, which is a company that does R as R as a service, and R as a statistical package that's open source, but they offer solutions around it. And it integrates with many of the standard distributions like Hadoop from Hortonworks, Cloudera, and MapR, and then some of the individual projects that are some of the like in-memory things like Spark and Storm, Flume, which is a great log reader product, Squoop, which allows you to move data back and forth between Hadoop and relational databases, and Kafka, which is a streaming analytics solution. But all of your data have value, and what Azure Data Lake is going to provide you is this rich capability to help and manage and secure those assets. You'll be able to monitor performance, see alerts, and audit usage in one place. And the other really cool thing about Azure Data Lake, and we'll talk a little bit more about Azure Active Directory a little bit later, it's going to provide you a robust identity and access management for all of your data. So you'll have one common access point for all of your data. This is coming in time. It's not quite ready yet, but it's definitely something worth talking about because I think it's going to be a very interesting big data solution from our friends at Microsoft. So before we finish talking about data sources, talk a little bit about cloud versus on-premises. So as much as Microsoft would want you to put everything in Azure, and they love it if you did, there are some cases where it's not a great solution to put everything there. If you own your own data center and you already own your own data center and you have very large workloads, it can be way more cost effective. It can be way more cost effective to have your own servers, just because at scale, Azure is still pretty expensive. If you have short-term use or you're trying to scale rapidly, those are really good solutions for cloud. If you just want to test a use case, if your capital's low, so if you're a new firm, that can be a really great solution. Or if all your data sources are in the internet, right? So if all your data sources are apps, that can be a really great way to go. On-prem, if you have large long-term implementations, so like when I worked for the big cable company, we had lots of big data warehouses that we knew were running forever, and there's pretty much no way I could have gotten that cheaper doing in the cloud. Shared clusters, so if you have your own very large Hadoop environment, it's not going to be as cost effective. Although all that stuff requires a big initial investment. And this is interesting. I see a question here about data virtualization platform. I was presenting in India last month, and Trevor, if you could put in the questions around, can you clarify a little bit what you mean about data virtualization? Not so much around platform names, but I was with some Microsoft people on stage, and neither of us had any answers about it because I'm not super familiar with it, and I'm pretty familiar in the open source space. So if you could clarify what you mean by that, because I'm still not clear on what it means. Data virtualization is kind of an interesting topic, and I'm not 100% sure what it means. So feel free to write a narrative in the question box, Trevor, and I'll see what I can answer with. So next we're going to talk about SQL 2016 and the BI new features. So these are some on-prem things that we're going to specifically talk about, and we're going to kind of go across the board from Engine through some of the SharePoint stuff. So our on-premises BI solution in SQL 2014 was a little bit bleak. If you Google SQL 2014 BI new features, you got this page that had 3 bullet points, and it was really kind of sad. Microsoft didn't do much. They did nothing to SQL Server reporting services. Analysis services tabular got a few enhancements, but relatively minor. I don't think SSIS got anything. And our visualization engine was SharePoint 2013. From a client perspective, we had Excel 2013. We had Power Pivot. We got Power Query, which came out of Data Explorer, which turned out to be an absolutely fantastic tool. Power Query is one of my favorite tools that Microsoft has written in a long time. We got Power Map, which was a really good demo. I'm not sure how much actual functionality a lot of people got out of it. And then we got Power View, which is a pretty fantastic visualization engine. Later in the year 2014, we got Power BI Desktop, which interestingly has no native on-prem options. So there's no way to deploy. You can build a report or a chart in Power BI Desktop, but you can't expand it you can't deploy it anywhere until Pyramid Analytics quite recently, about a month ago, came out with and they're a sponsor, so I didn't feel too bad about pimping their product. They came out with a product that allows you to deploy Power BI Desktop files to on-prem environments, and hopefully there'll be more vendors in the space soon, because I'd hate to see a monopoly, but that's definitely nice to have. So SQL Server 2016, we are definitely getting some enhancements. SSRS is getting some HTML5 love. So the big thing about HTML5, if you're not familiar, it will render in every browser. So here we see Edge, we see Chrome, we see Firefox, and this is going to render in all of the browsers. We get some modern charts, and I think there are probably some more charts coming down the road, but we get Sunburst and tree map charts. We get a modern version of Report Builder that looks a lot more like modern Visual Studio. And we're getting Power BI compatibility. We've been promised this for a long time, so I'm looking forward to actually seeing it in action. But we're going to be able to pin Power BI reports to our dashboard. That's going to be a very handy thing and very powerful. SSIS, for those of you who are on multidimensional, I'm sorry, there hasn't been a ton of new enhancements to multidimensional in the last few years. Tabular supports more data sources, so it's definitely where Microsoft's been spending most of their investment. If you look at 2012 and 2014, the number one enhancement is we get a ton of new functions to DAX. One of the things I was talking about yesterday with one of my clients was a true median function. There isn't a true median function, or excuse me, mean function, but there is a percentile function, so that'll function the same way. We get parallel processing for tabular models, which is kind of a big deal. Better performance for direct query, and GUI support for extended events. So extended events replacing Profiler eventually across the board in the SQL Server stack. We get to see that in SSIS Tabular 2016. SSIS gets a decent number of enhancements. So SSIS didn't work, SSIS, excuse me, didn't work real well with always-on availability groups. That's going to fail over nicely. We get incremental package deployment support for OData v4. So if you're not familiar with OData, it's a kind of a data supply system. So where we can get take data from cloud data sources and make it generally available in a secure fashion. That's going to be available through the streaming data. We're also going to get enhanced logging of our SSIS packages, so we'll get a little bit more logging. Lots of new connectors, so they're trying to make this a little bit more like Power Query. I don't know how much is going to get there by the time they go GA, but there will definitely be more connectors to things like Hadoop and mainly around the big data space. I think it's making SSIS more big data aware, and I think what I'd like to see over time is probably SSIS and Azure Data Factory come closer together so that it's a very similar tool whether or not you're on-prem or in the cloud. So, and then finally, SQL Server 2016 engine. The biggest thing is Revolution Analytics. Microsoft bought this company that's a big statistical analysis vendor. And I don't want to speculate too much, but where I'd like to see this go is I've done a lot of work with HP's database called Vertica. That's a columnar database, so it's a similar analytic database. And what that database has gone in is built in a lot of advanced statistical functions that are just built into their SQL code. So if we can get the ability to do advanced analytics using column store and SQL functions, I think there's some real benefit to that. Just from a code perspective, we don't have to worry about knowing, 3 languages, like knowing MDX, knowing DAX, and knowing T-SQL. If we can write it all in T-SQL, that's ideal. So that's where I'd like to see them go. We'll see where it ends up. Column store enhancements. So column store batch mode gets supported on way more operations. Column store indexes just get faster. Even if you're running queries single-threaded, they support batch mode. Those are some huge benefits around column store in 2016. I think it's a really great platform enhancement that we're seeing from Microsoft. Additionally, you can do in-memory column store. I think this is going to take a while to catch on. The in-memory features, which was formerly known as Hackathon, get a great deal of enhancements in SQL Server 2016. One of those is the ability to use column store indexes. I think in order for that to function from an analytics perspective, we're going to have to see servers with a lot more memory. I think that's coming in the next couple of years, but I'm not 100% sure on how far it's there. And one final thing, and this is a little bit of a Me Too thing because a lot of other databases were doing it, is we get support for JSON, which is, I like to say, is XML for hipsters. JSON is curly bracket XML. It feels quite similar. It's JavaScript object notation, but we're going to have commands like for JSON and from JSON, much like we have for XML and from XML in SQL Server now. So SQL Server will be able to translate JSON. The big thing around that is JSON's kind of the lingua franca of web apps, right? So frequently web apps are using JSON. Explain batch mode support, please. I have that question. So if you're not familiar with batch mode and column store indexes, traditionally SQL Server processes data row by row, right? So if you ever look at an execution plan in 2014, actually probably 2012 or higher, and you look at execution mode, you'll see row. And what row mode means is that SQL Server is processing that data row by row. If you throw a column store index on that table and you're doing a query that supports batch mode, you'll see that it's in batch mode. And what batch mode does is processes data 1,000 rows at a time. So very fast. It only works with column store indexes. So very, very cool. I've got some blog posts on it. If you can search Nico Nugeberger's blog. He's a Portuguese MVP. He's done a ton of writing around column store indexes, explains it in great detail. So next, let's talk about BI clients. So this is my favorite thing that I'm going to talk about the whole day, is that We finally get one unified toolkit of SQL Server data tools in Business Intelligence Design Studio in Visual Studio. And there's one Visual Studio that's going to work for all the versions and SKUs. Man, this is big, not to have 12 versions of Visual Studio versus what we used to have in the past. And then finally, we get SQL Server Management Studio support for DAX. So Power BI Desktop, this is independent of Excel. So this is this new thing that we were talking about. It has its own in-memory engine, much like Excel does with Power Pivot. This now supports DAX, and it's a complete dashboard design experience. So anything you see in the Power BI web client, you can do this. You'll have ability to do in the Power BI Desktop. This also revs every month. So stay on top of it. It's a little bit of a challenge. Finally, it has limited support for on-premises solutions. Like I mentioned, Pyramid Analytics is our main option there right now. So BI tools in Excel 2013. Most of you, I know this, I'm sure, but I had to put it here because it changes in 2016 because we all love Microsoft marketing. Power Pivot's kind of our modeling engine. It's where we build our relationships. Power Query is where we get our data. Power Map is where we want to do our advanced map visualization. And then Power View is where we do our general visualization and lay out things. We can use mapping there, but it's not animated. So just when we got used to all these power terms, Microsoft released a new version of Excel, which is going GA, I think, next week. So Power Pivot is still Power Pivot. However, Power Query is Get and Transform. That's changing the name. So Power Query is now Get and Transform. So just get used to it. I think it already kind of looks that way in the Power BI client. So that's a little bit of a challenge. We have 3D maps now instead of Power Maps, so they've changed that name as well. And Power View does stay the same. So not a total fundamental change, but Power Query is definitely changing. I kind of hate to see that branding go away because I just thought Power Query was such a great name. So what tools should you use? It really helps to understand your environment. Are you on-prem? Are you going to SharePoint? Are you going to Power BI? Are you going to some other different data source? And really, what do your users want from a data visualization perspective? Those are really the key things to ask and how you make the decision. So gateways to your data. This is kind of how you're going to do refresh in an environment. And there are several kinds of gateways in Azure with Power BI and Azure, and this gets a little confusing. The crazy thing is all of these are going to use the same executable file. So we have a personal gateway, a data management gateway, and the SQL Server Analysis Services connector. The Analysis Services connector is going to allow you to do real-time querying. The data management gateway and the personal gateway are going to allow you to do periodic refreshes. However, all of these use the same EXE, and they can't be on the same server. So this is a little bit of a challenge from an architectural perspective. So think about how you want to architect this. But if you're doing a lot of refreshing from on-prem data sources, you're probably going to need one of these gateways, and they're going to need to be in a zone in your network where they're exposed to the internet so they can get outbound. So we'll talk in the pre-con. We'll talk a lot more about this because how you architect this can be quite interesting depending on your environment. So what does the gateway do? It allows you to refresh data from on-prem data sources mainly. Some data, and this is mainly cloud, so if you have Azure Infrastructure as a Service or Azure SQL DB, this can be refreshed from an on-prem data sources. And it does allow for direct querying of some on-prem data sources. Currently, SSIS tabular, I'd probably like to see some more. I wouldn't be shocked if we saw SQL Server. You can also direct query, and when we say direct query, we mean live query as opposed to just doing a static refresh of on-prem data sources. So I think we'll see a couple of other things probably coming down the road. And then finally, single sign-on. This will be our last kind of subject matter area. This is going to be 45 minutes of the pre-con, so there's a lot of stuff here. You need an on-prem Active Directory. You may or may not need Active Directory Federation services, and because of Active Directory Federation services, you need Active Directory Certificate services, and then you may use DearSync, which was the old tool. It's now Azure Active Directory Sync services, and then you have Azure Active Directory. So this is how you do single sign-on. There's a lot of moving parts, and my goal in the pre-con is going to be to give you the right information to tell your domain administrator for what they need to do in order to do this. So in summary, modern business intelligence has a lot of moving parts. Things are challenging. We have software as a service, we have platform as a service, we integrate all this. Power BI does simplify combining all of them. We can integrate a lot of that software as a service stack stuff and bring it into visualizations and combine it with some of our on-prem data. SQL 2016 is going to have some really big gains for BI. So from a BI perspective, I feel like we haven't been loved in the last couple of versions of SQL Server, but we're definitely getting a lot of benefits in this one. And then finally, it takes a village to make this enterprise ready. You're going to need to work with your network team, your Active Directory team, get everybody on the same page and understand a lot about how all this stuff works. And we'll cover this in detail in the pre-con. So obviously I have 1 hour versus 6 to 7 in the pre-con, so we'll cover a lot more there. But it's not hard, but it's a lot of moving pieces. So does anyone have any questions?
Okay, thanks, Joey, for the overview of your pre-con session. So obviously you have read through a couple of questions and you've addressed them. So we'd like to welcome other attendees who may have some questions. Now's a good time.
So one follow-on to the question that I was asked about Batchmid by the gentleman. I saw your last message that you were a Power Pivot guy. So the engine that runs Power Pivot is effectively column store under the hood. So it's the Vertipack engine that Microsoft has. That's storing that data as column store and kind of doing some in-memory stuff there. So it's what's going on when you're using Power Pivot is quite similar to what's going on under the hood in the SQL Server engine when you're using column store indexes.
We've got another question coming up here. Can you shed light on how soon Power BI can get the drill down in matrix or table as well in Slicer's capability?
I can't at the moment. I know that functionality is quite frequently asked for. Have you heard anything about that recently?
Not that I know of, no.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think so Power BI releases are obviously fairly frequent. So check it out and go to their blog fairly frequently. Just I believe if you sign up, you should be able to get notified on what's new.
And Trevor has a question around what ports need to be made available for to support proxies. Yeah, I know the documentation's a little bit challenging. That stuff hasn't changed that much from when we wrote the white paper. If you could hit me up on Twitter, just follow me and I'll follow you back so I can DM you. I don't remember that stuff off the top of my head, but I can help you out with that. Because, yeah, especially if you're in a pretty blocked off network, it can be a little bit of challenge to make stuff talk to Power BI or through the connectors.
Okay, we still have 5 minutes to go. Anyone else have further questions? Actually, I do have a question about your pre-con, Joey. Mm-hmm. So what type of audience do you expect will benefit well from your session?
So I feel like it's a mix. So just to give you a little bit of background on myself, I have a kind of a very mixed BI and infrastructure background, so I cover a lot of space. So I think we're going to cover a lot about if your role as a BI architect, I think you're probably an ideal fit for this session because we're not just going to cover things on we're not going to go into the ones and zeros of technical detail, but we're probably going to go at a medium level with some deep dives onto configuration and architecture, right? So we're going to talk about how to make the right architectural decisions for your organization. And I see there's another question about, do you think Excel services will get integrated within Power BI in the future? It already kind of is. It's not the same as it is in SharePoint, but it's there's some of that within OneNote. So I could see the ability to access Excel files from OneNote. So I can see Microsoft going in that general direction. So I wouldn't be shocked if we saw full integration in the future.
Interesting. Yeah, the landscape is actually quite wide.
Yeah, it's so wide. It's so wide, and that's a little bit of the challenge of staying on top of the environment nowadays.
Okay, we've got another question around SSIS 2016 with HTML5. Can we expect we might have Android or phone apps for SSRS?
So the thing I'll say is, as soon as it gets into Power BI, you should have it. And I think I'm speculating. I don't know this for a fact. I think that's going to be the interface point for for SSRS. I'm not sure how that's going to work over just a straight browser connection, just because I haven't gotten to play with it yet.
Okay, we've got a couple of minutes left. We'll just wait for a few more seconds, otherwise we'll close this session so that you can get ready for the next one. All right, so if you have followed through the whole session, you may have already understood that Joey's pre-con session is on this particular topic, but it's in depth. You'll get around 7 hours of the whole content. And yeah, so sign up for it and use discount code of 24HOP15 or 24HOP15 as you see on the screen to save $200. I'd highly recommend to attend Joe's session. And as I mentioned before, if you're an architect, this is the session to go. And next, yeah, so I'd like to thank Joey for his time and his expertise. And again, I'd like to also thank our presenting sponsors, Microsoft, Idera, and Dell Software, and our supporting sponsors, Pyramid Analytics, SQL Center, and HP. I hope you have enjoyed this session as much as I did. Follow along on social media with @past24hop and share your thoughts on the event with hashtags past24hop and hashtag SQLPast. Thanks everyone. Hope you have a great time. And coming up next is the Enterprise Scripting Workshop with Sean McCon.